empty. The Bay of Gibraltar is one of the deepest bays found in Europe, but there's more than meets the eye as we delve into our waters. Throughout history, Gibraltar has been a port of call for many visitors and passerbys. Evidence found has proved that people like the Phoenicians, Romans and Moors, amongst others, once came by land and sea. Over the years, the Gibraltar Museum has been instrumental in investigating recovered artifacts from our waters, unveiling further our past in history.
Everyone is aware that Gibraltar has a lot of history, and we know that we can trace our history, well, all the way back to the Neanderthals, I suppose. But really, there's some parts of our history which are hidden to most people, and of course this is the part that's underwater at the moment. The Neanderthals exploited the area around Gibraltar, which was very different from what we see today, because their landscape had the sea level about 80 meters below the present level. Gibraltar's always been a very important port, and we've had a lot of activity. The first people who come to Gibraltar probably were the Phoenicians, and that's about 400 BC, very roughly, because obviously they were arriving and leaving throughout that time. And they were the ones, one of the first who started leaving traces and evidence of their presence behind underwater. Of course, none of us could see it because it was underwater, and it's only recently that we've been looking at the seabed to see the evidence of past visitors. We've got some very interesting artifacts here in the museum, but the museum's work, although we've had an active underwater research unit for some time, we weren't the first divers by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the first divers that are recorded were in the 18th century, and they were recovering some guns from a ship that had been wrecked off Gibraltar. So we do have quite a long history, and because it's underwater and we don't see it, we tend to be oblivious to it. We all know, we've heard about Gorham's Cave, and that's where a lot of the evidence of the Phoenicians is, because they had it was a place of worship, so they used to leave their offerings there, and then as they rounded the point, sometimes they needed to put down anchors, and their anchors got lost. It still happens today. We need to be aware of that. And they had the same problems as we do. When the storms came up, or when the currents were in the wrong direction, they had to set down anchor. And of course, sometimes they were lost. The Phoenicians used to use stone anchors, but the people who followed the Phoenicians were the Romans. The stocks of the Roman anchors that we can see here are essentially made of wood covered with lead, so they're very heavy. And this is what you find, this is what's left on the seabed. And you can see there's lots of different shapes and sizes. And this is just a small fragment of our collection. There's many more in storage. And what we've done in this one is we've tried to reproduce what it would have looked like. Obviously, over the years, the wood rots away, and all that's left is the lead stock. But this is what the anchor would have been when the Romans would have used it. And these are, this one was presented to the museum in 1957. So they've been found over the years, and people have been bringing them in. As a result of the presence of the Romans, there's a lot of lead anchors on the seabed around Gibraltar, and in fact the Gibraltar Museum has one of the most important collections of Roman anchors in the whole of the Mediterranean, and that includes Italy. one of the oldest artifacts that we have in the museum, but from more recent times, dates back to the Moorish period, probably the Marinids, who were around at the time when they were building the Tower of Homage, and a lot of activity was in Gibraltar. There was a lot of activity in the port of Gibraltar. It's a ceramic lamp, and the story with that one is quite funny. I was finishing a dive, and a group of divers came up to me and they said, "We found this, we don't know what it is, it doesn't look very interesting." And I went, "Yes, it's very interesting, you know," and then they were really curious, and I said, "Well, I think this is Moorish," and at the time it was covered in a lot of accretions, but I could see that obviously it had some interest to it. So that was another stage, if you like, in our history that's represented by finds from underwater. Okay, I'm going to show you here the Moorish lamp. Don't expect Aladdin's lamp. This is a ceramic lamp. It's missing its base, so you can imagine probably a wide base so that it would have been quite sturdy. And that's where the oil would have gone in. And the wick would come out through these slits, one on each side. And that would light, and the oil would keep it burning. The handle here would mean that if they needed to move it from one place to the next, they could do so easily. This is probably dating back to the Marinid dynasty, who were in Gibraltar in the 1300s. This would have been lamp used by somebody who didn't have a lot of money, didn't really care what the lamp looked like. It's not meant to be decorative or anything like that. This is purely functional. Would have been cheaply made, mass-produced for using on a day-to-day basis. And this was found off the runway in an area that we tend to call the bottle bank, because you find a lot of bottles there. And you might ask, why do we find so many bottles there? Well, the reason is that that used to be an anchorage towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and people used to throw bottles overboard, so you find a lot of bottles. And then more recently, about 2 years after the time that we celebrated or we commemorated the Battle of Trafalgar, we were diving off Rosy Bay in an area that divers locally call Inkwells, because we find a lot of inkwells there. And one of the divers who was coming onto the rib where we were diving from, he said, "Look, I found this and I think it's just a piece of rubbish." And immediately I could see that it was not a recent shoe. It wasn't modern. The first thing that, I mean, I don't know anything about shoes other than the fact that I wear them, but this would look very, very narrow and quite long for its width. Okay, this is the sole of a shoe or a boot that belonged to an officer who was probably alive around 1820. The significant thing about it is that it's very narrow and it's quite long. It's been studied by people who are specialists on shoes, and they tell us that it's about a size 7. Now, if I put my hand next to it, you'll see that a modern day size 7 would be only about that size. And the thing about the shoe is you can see the imprint of the foot of the officer. We know a lot about him. We know he was quite slender but quite tall. We also know that he was fairly well-to-do. He was able to spend quite a lot of money on this boot, but at the same time he repaired it at least on 2 occasions, and you can see where the repairs have been made. You might ask me how I know it was an officer. Well, I think the most obvious way of understanding that is, first of all, it's an expensive shoe, so a sailor wouldn't have seen, a naval seaman wouldn't have had the money to buy that kind of shoe. But also, they would have not worn shoes on board most of the time. They would have been barefoot because it meant they had a better grip when they were up in the rigging. And eventually, we sent it to UK to have it properly conserved, because this is a very specialized science, and it couldn't be done in Gibraltar. The people who have been looking at it, the specialists, were very excited. This is one of the first shoes of this era that they had had a chance to look at. because normally, you see, shoes are intact when they look at them, so they can't take them to bits because obviously they destroy them. So this was the opportunity to get to understand what especially the reinforcement in this area was made of, because they didn't know whether it was going to be metal or wood, and in fact it's metal, and that is why we know it's about 1820, because that's when they start using metal for this reinforcement. One of the most wonderful resources that we have here in the museum for people doing research on the port of Gibraltar is, during the 19th century, the port department of the time used to keep records of every ship that was coming into Gibraltar and leaving Gibraltar. As you go through the book, let's very carefully open it. We've jumped to 1823. Again, this is completely at random. You can see how the cargo will have been changing. So now here there's wine, paper, oil, mail, tobacco, potatoes. When you start putting this information into a database, and this is very painstakingly being put into a database, you start being able to analyze it and see what patterns emerge. And this is where we were able to detect how in a port log like this, a book like this written by a clerk on his daily work, we were able to detect how the cargo changed that coincided with the Irish potato famine. And that's fascinating because it means that you can link something which, you know, was being done on a daily basis by somebody with a historical fact that you can read up in history books and find out more about. But it also affected Gibraltar. It also affected where the ships were coming from. All of a sudden, you can see how there's an increase in ships coming from the Eastern Mediterranean with their wheat. And this is all coming out of these port logs. It's not just something you read about in the history books. You can actually see it coming to life in the port logs.
One of the museum's ongoing projects, which also earned them a prize, was a discovery and research on the Second World War armed trawler HMS Aaron.
They were halves of ships, but we didn't know if it was two halves of one or if it was two bits that had deteriorated independently. And that became a research project which took quite a while, but eventually we got down to the bottom of it and we found out the information about what the ship was, what they were doing there, why it was out there, why it was in two pieces.
We found out that both bits of the wreckage were designed the same way. They were riveted metal hull sections, so that narrowed it down from sort of 1850s to 1950s. And from the width and the size of the steam engine, we realised that it was something about 400 tonnes. So we were able to go to specific research then, and we found out that there's three possible contenders. All had been sunk during the Second World War, and they were all armed trawlers.
And it was actually smudged in the trip to the UK, who actually found a letter in the Public Records Office marked top secret. It's all very interesting. And what he found was that this armed trawler called the Aaron had been sunk by saboteurs in January 1942 in Gibraltar. And then she was taken out of the harbour and broken up underwater. And that fitted exactly with what we had on the seabed.
We are all aware that we have to protect our heritage, and I feel that as a diver I'm privileged to be able to go down to see things on the seabed, the wrecks, the artificial reefs, the evidence of debris on the seabed. We have a responsibility because not everyone can go down there to see it, and it's not just my heritage, it's not just the heritage of the diver, it's Gibraltar's heritage. Some would argue it's the world's heritage. Apart from the fact that the law of Gibraltar extends to anything that's found underwater, that's over 50 years old, it's regarded as an antiquity and therefore, by law, has to be presented to the museum. If you take something out of the sea, it's been in the sea for maybe 100 years. It's been absorbing the salt from the seawater. It's been exposed to certain temperatures, to certain conditions. So it has been deteriorating. They need to be treated in laboratory conditions, and the salt has to be taken out at a controlled rate so that it doesn't get damaged.